So Mel, really great to have you back. And we're going to talk now about soil care recommendations for policy actions. So I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. And yeah, sorry for just popping up out of the blue in the middle of your conversation. It's out of my hands. So good afternoon again, everyone. And we're now going to talk about recommendations for actions to facilitate the uptake of SIX. And before I start, I just want to briefly highlight that while you only see my name and those the names of my colleagues from Milieu on here, what I'm presenting now is really the result of, or a product of, a process involving many, many project partners and stakeholders. And I think Hedvig's presentation already illustrated that quite effectively. We started with data collection, interviews, and workshops at the study site level, where we explored different barriers that I showed you earlier. We looked at different actions that could be taken, and we then scaled that up to an extent, presented that to stakeholders at the EU level, where we looked at those barriers again and tried to discuss, refine, and develop further policy actions or actions that could be facilitated by policy in order to promote the uptake of the SIX, of our soil improving cropping systems. So I just wanted to again say thank you to everyone who contributed. Okay, just as a brief reminder, earlier we talked about barriers, and you see on the left just a summary overview of the kind of barriers that we found or that were reported to us from the sites. And on the right, I just popped in the graph from the poll that we had earlier, just to remind you all what you said were the most important barriers. So here we're looking at the economic environment, we're looking at knowledge and information, but also social cultural factors and policy. So the question that we want to discuss with this presentation, or that I want you to bear in mind, is how could EU and national regional policy facilitate actions to promote the uptake of SIX? And I need to explain that when we talk about policy actions, we mean the whole range of actions. We don't just talk about regulation. It's about economic instruments. It's about planning instruments, information, a mix of those instruments. So how did we go from the barriers, the exploration of barriers, to developing actions, recommendations for actions? And I think you've heard it now before. We basically asked our stakeholders at EU level and in the sites. We asked them which actions could you remove barriers or strengthen enablers, how effective would they be in facilitating the adoption of SIX, and how likely or easy would it be to implement these actions. And this is just a screenshot, and I think you should be able to again, if you push the button at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see other outputs similar to this one. This is a screenshot from the most recent exercise of stakeholder workshop that we did at EU level, and I recognize some of the names in the chat. I know some of you were there. This is based on the work that Hedvig presented, and the scenarios that we developed together, where we used the different scenarios to come up with actions. And this is one part of the process, where on the left-hand side, you see all the different barriers per category. On the right-hand side, you see the different actions that were proposed by the stakeholders. They are in different colors because we had different rotating groups. So green was one group, blue was another group. You also see tick marks, and the tick marks are indicate those actions that stakeholders identified as most important for encouraging the uptake of soil improving cropping systems. So this is just one example. Please go to the Padlet via the link, and you can see in total you can see 4 of these that just show you what kind of actions were developed. I want to present to you the 5 overarching recommendations for action that we developed based on the insights that we gained from our interaction with the stakeholders. Under each of these broad actions, there are more detailed actions, and I will try to go through them, but please understand that I cannot cover everything. So again, you should be able to access a more detailed description of these recommendations through the Padlet. I think we have a summary there. And then again, if you want to look at actions at the study site level, go to the policy summaries. You will find them there. Now let's start with the first one, defining long-term ambitions and targets. We've seen in Mirko's presentation earlier, Mirko Barbero from the Commission, that there are quite a lot of developments now to establish targets, soil targets at EU level. Historically, that's been a gap in terms of target setting at EU level. And we think that now with these different initiatives, there's a real opportunity to define these ambitions and to come up with targets, not just for soil and for the soil health as we want it to be, and that we still need to define, I think. Also targets for different pressures affecting different soil functions or causing soil threats. And I think we're going in the right direction, looking at some of the targets that we see in the biodiversity strategy, that we see in the zero pollution ambition, and also now that we're expecting with the nature restoration targets that measure really specific sectors, specific threats, in order to realize these broader ambitions. Obviously, there is still a gap in terms of dedicated soil policy. Yes, we will have the soil strategy, but the soil strategy is, as the name suggests, a strategic document. So we still need to rely on sectoral policies, environmental policies, to promote, facilitate, incentivize the use of SIGs. As you all know, or well, I'm aware that we have participants from all over the world, but at EU level, one of the key policies that we have is the Common Agricultural Policy, which really is the main driver for agriculture in Europe. And here we are still waiting for the new policy, which is still being negotiated. But here we see that there are new interventions being put in place which provide opportunities for promoting soil improving cropping systems. And from the EU level, we feel there's a great opportunity to provide advice to the member states and what kind of practices could be supported through eco schemes. And there has been a publication recently by the Commission where certain practices were listed. So even though the member states have a lot of flexibility now in defining the practices that they want to fund, the Commission can really try to provide some guidance here and steer the development in the member states. We also feel that there's a scope for Commission action within the formal review and approval process of the new CAP strategic plans and the monitoring. So there is really some scope to guide the process and to guide the interventions to some extent. Now moving on to the next recommendation, coherence between policies and policy objectives. If you remember, we saw from the study site partners who reported on their experiments that in some places there are some conflicts with, if you use the example of Belgium again, with waste legislation. We've also heard from a lot of other sites that there's a potential conflict with food policy and the objective of increasing food supplies or food production within the country. So there is a need to balance the different objectives and different policies. And one suggestion that our stakeholders had was to actually make soil a stronger component in policy evaluations, meaning that if there are new policy suggestions or initiatives there should be an integrated assessment looking at different criteria when looking at potential impacts and benefits of policies, in integrating soil in that assessment, especially since soil is cross-cutting in nature and should have a high priority when we talk about policy evaluation. The new Common Agricultural Policy integrates much better than before environmental objectives by really explicitly listing the different policies that should be integrated and that should be taken into account when designing interventions. But there is still a potential conflict between these interventions and some of the sectoral objectives. As I just said, food waste might be some of these topics. Also energy might be problematic. There's also clearly a need to change the policy-making process in the sense that it needs to be much more inclusive. And this is something that was mentioned a lot, both at the EU level, but also when we talk to stakeholders at the local level, that there is a disconnect between the policies and the people on the ground, people implementing policies, people needing to comply with policies, and that there's a real need for better feedback and feedback loops. And again, we welcome the fact that this is something that is, at least on paper, highlighted both in the farm to fork strategy, but also in the Common Agricultural Policy, where the CAP strategic plans should be designed and developed with strong interaction with farmers, with other stakeholders. Now moving on to policy instruments, specifically economic instruments. Financial incentives need to be more targeted, both tied to specific actions and regions, taking into account environmental and geographic conditions. If you remember earlier, we spoke about the example of Portugal, where you have winter cover crops that are being incentivized, but that are maybe not beneficial to all regions of the country. So there is a need for a more regional approach. And the new Common Agricultural Policy, the delivery model that's proposed there, is certainly a step in the right direction, and it provides opportunity to define regional and additional mandatory requirements. Most of us are familiar with the good agro-environmental conditions, which are mandatory elements of the policy, which farmers have to comply with in order to get financing. The member states are free to come up with the standards that are specific to specific regions based on the assessments of their needs. They can also come up with additional standards. So there is an opportunity to really exploit this mechanism. And of course, you have the eco schemes on top of that. I already mentioned them, where you can design different schemes for different regions. I think someone in the chat asked about how to balance SIG's adoption with this objective of increasing food production. We feel that one of the questions that need to be asked is which practices can serve multiple objectives. So if you have the objective of increasing food production, but you also want to improve soil quality, which should be targeted through economic incentives in your region or in your country. We also need to reward benefits delivered, and I think carbon farming is currently one of the big buzzwords here. And again, there's a need to involve farmers when designing these instruments. It's also important to ensure that sorry. I built a stand-up desk so the cat would not disturb me, and of course she just did, so apologies. So in order to facilitate the transition to sustainable practices, we also need to think about time frames. So one aspect we need to think about is that these financial instruments need to cover a longer time frame that they often do in order to provide farmers with a certain certainty and trust towards these instruments and a willingness to change. We also need to think about non-financial instruments, and suggestions that were often made was the setting up of machinery exchanges, where maybe at regional, local level, machines would be made available to groups of farmers, or there could be national seed banks. So there are other ways of providing long-term support that are not necessarily financial as such, or would involve payments to farmers directly. And here on the right-hand side, so I don't forget it, I want to highlight that Hedvig just presented her applicability maps. So these are a great tool to think about practices that could be incentivized regionally. They give a really nice indication of where a certain practice could be relevant and applicable. Now, we obviously also need to think about monitoring and enforcement. Again, this is something that has been pointed out as a gap several times across the different study sites we worked in, and that there's a need for clear, robust, and reliable monitoring and enforcement, both in terms of frameworks in the sense of having indicators and targets, but also institutions. Going back to the CAP again, this has been an ongoing discussion, the Common Agriculture Policy, that we're still monitoring hectares or the areas where a measure is applied, rather than assessing environmental improvements in general. Obviously, when we talk about soil, we have a real problem still in defining what soil quality is and what kind of outcomes we want. And this is just a short table that I included here within SoilCare. Our colleagues did propose a set of indicators that could be used to measure soil quality, also yield, because we looked at both, over a short period of time. Obviously, for longer periods, you might want other indicators, but they give an indication of the kind of indicators that could be used. Also, if you look at the soil strategy that Mirko presented, there are also there is a list of indicators that could be used to monitor soil quality as part of monitoring the implementation and the impacts of policy. There could also be better use for monitoring could be also improved by coordinating monitoring of different policies. There's also a need to train farm inspectors and to have dedicated monitoring units and agencies looking at soil health. And now the last recommendation refers to knowledge and learning, and it's probably best to start at the bottom, because this is really a process where we need a strong foundation. So on the one hand, it's become clear that soil health needs to be better integrated, and it needs to be a really strong component in the training of farmers. Obviously, farmers have a lot of knowledge when it comes to soil, but at the same time, it was mentioned that modern production methods don't necessarily benefit the farmers' knowledge when it comes to soil, and often they don't have the time to really be on the field and to observe what's happening on their soil. So it's quite important to have soil health as part of their education. We also need to acknowledge, and I tried to make that point earlier, that farmers operate in a very complex system, and they don't always have the capacity to follow advice. So it's not just about providing knowledge and then they can act on it. We need to understand that it's much more complex than that, which then also means that we need different types of instruments. There is a need to strengthen the capacity of farming services. That means having continued funding, training of farm advisors. And then there's a need for regular training and information on the 6 costs and benefits. We need to provide evidence of short as well as long-term benefits. And I think that was flagged in one of your comments earlier. There also needs to be information on policy requirements. And crucially, we need to feed back the outputs of the work that we do of research back to farmers and back to advisory services. This cannot just stay within this community. I'll try to wrap this up. One thing I wanted to highlight is the need for lighthouses. If you have ever looked at the soil mission that has been proposed, there's the idea of having living labs where farmers can really, where you can demonstrate to farmers at a regional level how certain practices work in their region, how they can be adapted. And at the same time, it's not just about learning for farmers, it's also about educating the consumers. So here we need to think about not just providing information, but also working with innovation awards, soil footprints, etc. And I want to close with this. So these were the general recommendations that we came up with. I also showed you the work that we did in our most recent workshop with stakeholders at EU level, where we asked them to identify the most important actions that could facilitate the uptake of 6, and then we asked them how likely would they be would they succeed in facilitating the uptake of 6. And these are this is a slightly consolidated list, but I think it's interesting that if you look at the first 3, which are more policy oriented, it's about what I said earlier, integrating soil health in sustainability assessments, creating mechanisms to ensure feedback between legislators and stakeholders, and then it's about economic instruments. So those are actions really looking at policy instruments and policy design. Better technologies to minimize external inputs. Then we have some actions looking at consumers, labeling, certifications, but also taxation. Why is it not possible that maybe we should all pay more for products that are or food that is produced through unhealthy practices, and then reinvest that into 6, and maybe that way also lower prices to products that result from sustainable practices. Lighthouse projects were identified as one of the key actions. And then the need to provide platforms at local level for farmers to interact and exchange knowledge. And with that, I want to thank you and conclude. If you want more detailed information, you can check our deliverables. You can check the country reports, the policy summaries. There's also a long list of policy briefs that you can find on our website. So please feel free to go there and read up on the details.